World War I. You've probably heard it called the Great War, or, maybe a little too optimistically, the war to end all wars. It was a conflict that completely shattered the world, chewed up entire empires for breakfast, and basically drew the blueprint for the rest of the chaotic 20th century. It is huge, it's confusing, it's a mess, but we're going to break it down. We're going to trace how this whole global catastrophe started with one single, almost unbelievable event.
Okay, so this is the central question, and it sounds like a joke, right? How on earth does a driver making a wrong turn in Sarajevo, a city in Bosnia, kick off a chain reaction that kills 20 million people and topples four of the world's most powerful empires? It just doesn't sound real, but it is. And this is the story of how that happened. It is, without a doubt, the most tragic, complicated, and frankly absurd domino effect in all of human history.
So you have to understand something crucial right up front. The assassination of this one guy, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, wasn't really the cause of the war, it was just the match. The truth is, Europe in 1914 was basically a giant powder keg that had been packed with explosives for decades. Everybody was just looking for an excuse. It was like the most tense family dinner you can possibly imagine, where everyone hates each other, but they're all smiling while secretly hiding weapons under the table. They were just waiting for someone to knock over a glass of water.
And if you want to understand what was in that powder keg, you just need to remember one easy little acronym. MAIN. M is for militarism, basically a massive arms race where every country was trying to build a bigger, badder army and navy than the next guy. A is for alliances, this incredibly tangled web of I got your back promises that we'll get into in a second. I is for imperialism, the mad scramble for colonies all over Africa and Asia, which created a ton of rivalries. And finally, N for nationalism. This was the super intense, toxic kind of pride that it convinced every country that they were the best, that God was on their side, and that a glorious war would prove it. Put those four things together, and you have a recipe for absolute disaster.
Okay, so let's talk about the A for alliances, because this is the tripwire. The best way to think about it is like two rival high school cliques, or maybe two giant international group chats. On one side, you have the Triple Entente, that's Britain, France, and Russia. On the other side, you have the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And the rule for both groups was simple. If an outsider messes with one member of the chat, everyone else has to jump in and defend them. It was supposed to keep the peace, but what it actually did was guarantee that one little scrap in a corner of Europe would drag everybody else into the fight. And here is a perfect picture of the M for militarism in action. Just look at this thing. This monster is the HMS Dreadnought. When Britain launched it in 1906, it was so powerful and so advanced that it instantly made every other battleship on the planet obsolete. It was like the iPhone of warships. And of course, the second Germany saw it, they said, we need one of those, no, we need 10 of those. And as you can see from the chart, that kicked off this insane naval arms race. It was basically a hugely expensive contest to see who could build more of these giant floating metal death machines. It didn't make anyone safer, it just made everyone a whole lot more paranoid. All right, so Germany is looking at the map, and they see France on their west and Russia on their east. A war on two fronts is an absolute military nightmare. So they came up with a plan, a very detailed, very clever, and, as it turns out, a very, very wrong plan. It was their ultimate scheme to win a war quickly and avoid getting bogged down. And it backfired in probably the most spectacular way imaginable.
So this was the genius idea. It was called the Schlieffen Plan. Here's how it was supposed to go down. Step 1. Instead of attacking France's heavily fortified border directly, you cheat. You swing your army north and punch right through neutral little Belgium to get around the French defenses. Sorry, Belgium. Step 2. You have to do this super fast. The plan called for defeating the entire nation of France in just 6 weeks. Why 6 weeks? Because that's how long they figured it would take Russia, with its massive but clumsy army, to get its act together and mobilize. And step 3, once France is knocked out, you put all your soldiers on trains, zip them across Germany to the Eastern Front, and then deal with the Russians. Simple, right? Well, the whole thing rested on two tiny little assumptions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. 1, that Belgium wouldn't really fight back, and 2, that Britain would just sit back and watch Germany invade a neutral country it had promised to protect. Oops.
And at first, believe it or not, the plan almost worked. The German army poured into Belgium and then northern France like a giant tidal wave, pushing the French and the small British army back and back almost to the very edge of Paris. It looked like the war might actually be over in a few weeks. But then came the First Battle of the Marne. In September of 1914, in a desperate, sprawling, bloody fight, the Allied armies finally dug in their heels and managed to stop the German advance.
The Battle of the Marne was a massive victory for the Allies. It saved Paris, and more importantly, it absolutely shattered the Schlieffen Plan. Germany's gamble for a quick, decisive victory had failed, and the consequence of that failure defined the rest of the war. Because neither side could advance and neither would retreat, they did the only thing they could do to survive. They started digging. They dug trenches for protection, and then more trenches. And soon, this incredible 700-kilometer-long scar of mud, barbed wire, and death stretched all the way from the border of Switzerland to the North Sea. The short, glorious war was over. The long, miserable one was just beginning.
And that failure, the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, leads us directly to the single most enduring image of World War I, the trenches. For the next 4 years, the battle lines on the Western Front would barely move more than a few miles in either direction. It became a static war of attrition, a horrifying industrial-scale slaughterhouse where millions of men would live and die in some of the worst conditions ever devised by humankind.
I mean, just look at this. This photo tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't a war of heroic cavalry charges. It was a nightmare, a world of constant mud that could suck you down, rats the size of small dogs, and the ever-present stench of death and decay. The danger wasn't just from bullets or artillery shells. Soldiers died from diseases like dysentery, from trench foot, where their feet would literally rot from being constantly wet, and from the pure psychological terror of waiting for that whistle to blow, telling you it was your turn to climb over the top and run into a wall of machine gun fire.
Now, you'd think that after a year or two of this, the generals would figure out that just sending waves of men running at machine guns wasn't a winning strategy. But for the most part, they didn't. They were convinced that if they just threw enough men at the enemy in one massive attack, they could finally break through. This thinking led to these meat grinder battles. In 1916 at Verdun, the German plan was literally to bleed the French white, to kill so many French soldiers that the country would be forced to surrender. The French held on and won, but at the cost of almost 400,000 men. In response, later that year, the Allies launched their own big push, the Battle of the Somme. The goal was a glorious breakthrough. The result was just more stalemate and pointless slaughter.
57,000. I want you to just let that number sink in. That is the number of casualties, killed or wounded, that the British Army suffered on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916. Almost 20,000 of them were killed in a single day. It remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British military. It's a number that's almost impossible to get your head around, and it perfectly captures the insane industrial-scale futility of the war on the Western Front. So for years, the war is just locked in this bloody, horrifying stalemate. A few yards are gained here, a few are lost there, and hundreds of thousands of men die in the process. But then, in the year 1917, two massive events happen thousands of miles away from the trenches that will completely flip the chessboard of the war and finally break the deadlock.
So what were these game changers? Well, it was a massive one door closes, another one opens situation for the Allies. First, Russia taps out. The country completely implodes in the Russian Revolution. The Tsar is overthrown, and the new communist government immediately signs a peace treaty with Germany to get out of the war. For Germany, this is fantastic news. The entire Eastern Front is now closed. They can move all their troops west for one final push. But at almost the exact same time, a new player enters the game. The United States of America finally tags in. After years of staying neutral, Germany's policy of using its submarines to sink any ship approaching Britain, including American civilian ships, finally pushes the U.S. over the edge and into the war.
And this is the man who made that fateful decision, President Woodrow Wilson. America's entry into the war was basically a death sentence for Germany and the Central Powers. And it wasn't just about the millions of fresh, eager American soldiers who would start pouring into Europe. It was America's incredible industrial power. The U.S. could produce ships, tanks, guns, and food on a scale that the exhausted European powers just couldn't match anymore. And Wilson also brought a powerful new idea to the fight. He framed America's involvement as a noble crusade to make the world safe for democracy.
So, with America's fresh troops and industrial might tipping the scales, the Allies were finally able to break the stalemate. They launched a major offensive in 1918 that pushed the exhausted German army back across France. And finally, at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, an armistice was signed. The guns fell silent. But the world that emerged from the rubble of the Great War was a completely different planet. And the war had set in motion changes that no one could have possibly predicted.
I mean, the sheer scale of the change is just breathtaking. 4 ancient, powerful empires, the German,
the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian, were just gone, wiped off the map. In their place, the world map was redrawn with new countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The winners met in Paris and created the Treaty of Versailles, which formally blamed Germany for the war and saddled it with crippling debt, a decision that would have disastrous consequences later. And in a burst of idealism, they created the League of Nations, a global organization designed to make sure a catastrophe like this could never, ever happen again.
But the war's impact wasn't just about changing borders. It triggered massive social change, often in the most unexpected ways. Before the war, this quote from Woodrow Wilson pretty much summed up a very common view. The argument against women voting was often that they were too delicate, too emotional, and lacked the real-world experience that men had, while World War I was about to completely demolish that argument.
You see, when millions of men left their jobs to go fight in Europe, someone had to keep the country running, and that someone was women. They poured into factories, built shells and airplanes, worked on farms, and took on all sorts of jobs that had previously been considered men's work. And as you can see from this data, it had a direct political impact. As women's role in the war effort grew, so did the support in Congress for giving them the right to vote. It became pretty hard to tell a woman she didn't deserve a say in her country's future when she was literally building the weapons to defend it.
And so, in one of the great unforeseen consequences of the war, the vital contribution of women to the war effort became a powerful, undeniable argument for suffrage. It helped push the 19th Amendment over the finish line, leading to one of the biggest expansions of democracy in American history, all as a byproduct of this brutal global conflict. As the war was just beginning, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, looked out his window in London and said something absolutely chilling and prophetic. "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He knew that this wasn't just another war. It was the end of an entire world, the world of the 19th century. It was the end of an era, and it was plunging humanity into a new, darker, and far more violent century.
So, from a wrong turn in Sarajevo, to a domino effect of alliances, to the bloody stalemate of the trenches, and ultimately to a conflict that not only redrew the map of the world, but helped redefine the role of women in society, the First World War stands as a terrifying lesson in just how fragile our world is and how one single tripwire can set the entire planet on fire.